Quisiera agradecer a Diana Sheehan, directora de Cantar Retail, por estar presente el día de hoy. Diana nos va a hablar de las tendencias en los principales formatos del retail a nivel global y su impacto en Latinoamérica. Obviamente Diana viene de Estados Unidos. Diana, por favor.
I got it. Thank you. Buenos días. Bienvenido. That's about all the Spanish I have right now, so I'm sorry about that. I tried. I'll be better next time. So today what I'm here to do is talk to you a bit about global retail trends and how that's really impacting and influencing Latin American trends and vice versa. And so what we'll do is we have a few minutes to really kind of walk through what's happening, what does it mean, and it's going to connect a lot to what I've seen a lot of your speakers talk about over the last day, and also what they'll be talking about today. So, as we really jump into what we're going to do, we're going to talk about the big trends in retail across the globe, and particularly in Latin America. Then we're going to talk a bit about e-commerce. I know you have a lot of experts that are speaking about that as it translates to Latin America specifically. I'm just going to touch on it from a macro view. And then what we'll do is we'll really move into, from an innovation perspective, what is happening at retail holistically. And how can retailers and manufacturers capitalize on that change and really grow their business? So a couple things to think about at first. One of the things that we know across the world, but also very specifically in Latin America, is that we have an evolving demographic. We have an evolving population that essentially connects to things like the aging consumer, younger families, movement geographically where people are choosing to live, and all of that very clearly and directly correlates to what shoppers want and need in their retail environment. We also have this idea of suburbanization. And especially in Latin America, as you look at the movement of consumers within various countries in Latin America, there is a clear movement kind of to city cores, but also beyond city cores to suburban environments. This idea of looking to store as a way to enhance experience, and I can tell you, I spent the afternoon yesterday walking around a few stores just across the street, and if you look at the experience and the level of experience that you bring to your shoppers here in Chile and in Latin America as a whole, it really speaks to a best-in-class practice that in some countries they're just getting started at. But it's also something that, when you pair in-store experiences that are elevated and combine it with the e-commerce movement that really is never going to go away, it's a new way of working, you bridge a connection that allows shoppers to have everything they want outside of the home and inside of the home in retail. One of the things that we look at that drives kind of not only the way that we experience stores with this connection between physical and digital, but also the movement of e-commerce, is this elevation of two different things: access to credit and cash transfers, and mobile access, which leads to internet access in a lot of cases. And as you look at Latin America and you look at how far along and what the growth looks like in these markets, Latin America is ripe for a retail evolution that integrates both physical and digital experiences and allows shoppers to get the convenience and the value that they want when and where they want it. Another element of this is really looking from a population perspective about how things are changing. There's a new middle class growing in Latin America. And what's interesting is it's actually a very complex group of people. And that complexity leads to both manufacturers and retailers needing to build different strategies to target different groups within that population. Now, while this group, they're definitely high spenders, They have discretionary income that they want to use in retail outlets. But as you look at that group and you break it into kind of the older professionals who are moving into the back end of their spending cycle, those young professionals that are coming up and moving right into that time in which they're earning the most, and then those that are just on the cusp between middle class and below middle class, but are spending like middle class, there are different needs, not just from a financial services perspective, but also from a product offer and retail execution perspective. And then this idea of the kind of, as you look at the incremental revenue that they have in their home and the discretionary spending, that element of understanding from country to country how that will essentially manifest itself as they come into your stores and the levels within those tiers of middle class. The next thing that I want to talk to is this idea of suburban. And my understanding is this really isn't new news to you. You know and you see it every day and you live it every day. The idea of people moving in from rural into those core city marketplaces. But what you see here, and I apologize, I noticed as I was reviewing this that the legend got cut off, but the chart that is on kind of the left-hand side is really looking at this idea of where is population growth in major metropolitan areas. The light blue line on the top of that graph is suburban population growth. The darker blue line, that often is actually negative, is core city population growth. That suburban movement demands the need for retail outlets that are going to provide those suburban commuter shoppers new means to shop. And that's where you see this movement in malls is coming from. And what's fascinating with malls is there's so many opportunities as you look at that multi-store outlet to provide experiences that are utterly and completely unique for the shopper. And you see that as you cross the street and you go to Falabella and you go and you look at some of these retail outlets that are doing very, very interesting things. On the other element of that, what you've got is you've also got the idea of if your shoppers are spending an hour to commute into the city to their job and an hour to commute out of the city to their job, which many of us do. I actually live in the suburbs of Chicago, and that's it. I lose 2 hours of work a day, 2 hours of time a day commuting into my job. That's 2 hours less with my family at night. That's 2 hours less to do errands. It's 2 hours less. And in that 2 hours less, I have to find a way to get things that are quick and easy. And what's fascinating is, on the one hand, as you talk about malls creating platforms that have easy access for shoppers to get in and do their shopping, on the other end, that suburban movement and the time constraints that it take into effect actually also really push the need for e-commerce platforms where they don't have to stop. And so you have this push and pull between the two that this movement alone is a key driver of. And you can see here, this is an example in Sao Paulo of just that direct correlation to cities' growth and the suburban growth that goes with it and how that's changed over time. And this is kind of happening over and over and over again in many cities throughout Latin America. And then you've got internet penetration. And that's one of those things that if you look in the last 20 and 30 years, one of the things that was the most disruptive to almost every industry in the world is the internet, because it allows us a new way to work. But within retail, it's just been in the last 10 years that it's really started to play a role. And you can see here kind of what that penetration looks like in Latin America versus the rest of the world. You can also see what it looks like country by country. So as you try to understand where the growth in your e-commerce business is going to come from, this gives you some direction. But also note that where you're going to need digital communication strategies for your shoppers beyond e-commerce, where you're going to need a strategy that allows you to connect what shoppers find in store with what they find on their phone or on their computer are going to be critical. Because you can't have differing strategies because your shoppers are looking in both places at the same time. And what you see here is that connection between internet growth and income, which also pushes back and correlates to things like that growing middle class and the importance that it has. You also see how you want to talk to your shoppers. And one of the biggest things that you have to understand is some of those platforms like Instagram and Twitter and WeChat and Facebook are new advertising mediums for you. You've got to be there just as much as you have to be on TV or in print or in email. And you can see there the red butts that really focus on Latin America. Now, what this really all comes down to is a few quick things. And I know that a lot of this is not new news, so I didn't want to spend a ton of time here. But really what it comes down to is as the population and as economies in Latin America continue to evolve, and as consumers, as that millennial workforce, that younger workforce comes in and drives change, retailers and manufacturers in Latin America have to evolve and change with them, without alienating that older base consumer who's been the driver of your business for a very long time. We also have to understand the role of consumer credit access and how that opens up the door for not only e-commerce, but for other retail opportunities within store. Understanding from a banking rule perspective some of that kind of the components of consumer credit and how those laws are different from country to country also have an impact on an e-commerce space. And then this idea of the new middle class, that role of cash transfers over credit, and how that impacts change is something to keep in mind as you move forward. And then the urban to suburban piece, and I can't emphasize this enough, that suburban movement is driving mall growth in Latin America today. And from what I've seen, Latin America is really right now the global leader in innovation within traditional mall-based retail. Other countries, other continents are looking to Latin America for innovation and inspiration because you're in a place of strength here as the demographics change and your shoppers need new things. But that same suburban element also lends itself incredibly well to e-commerce and how it manifests over time. Today, we look at e-commerce in Latin America very much as a home delivery concept. But, and this is something we've already started to see in North America and in Europe, the evolution of models like click and collect, ordering online, picking up in store for suburban markets is probably something that's coming down the path. And then finally, just that idea of the internet penetration and the population. How we as consumers evaluate and explore where we shop and how we shop and what we shop for are directly influenced by how much information and access we have to content online. So now, I think I've set the stage, and what I'll do is just talk very briefly about how we've seen e-commerce evolve and play out in Latin America over the last few years. Now, first and foremost, one of the things that we know is that smartphones in Latin America are very much the driving force between how shoppers stay digitally connected to the businesses that they relate to and to everyone else. And this is a trend that's not going away. One of the things as manufacturers or retailer, and very frankly, this is a global trend, whether you are in Latin America, North America, Europe, Asia, or Africa. The idea of e-commerce that is laptop-based is very quickly getting old. It's moving directly to mobile technology. Recognizing that as you build your platforms and your communication strategies and your content with that mobile device in mind is critically important. And at this point, as you look to that, recognizing the nuances between mobile communication and what that looks like and feels like versus other ways of talking to shoppers is very important. In any country that has an e-commerce movement, one of the things that we've seen over and over and over again is key buying holidays are the driving force that push people into trying e-commerce for the first time. And you see here, as we've talked to, as a number of companies have kind of interviewed shoppers in Latin America, that's what they are actually even kind of lending themselves to saying, is this idea that at Christmas, during Cyber Monday, during those holidays where I know that I am going to spend money on gifts and services and things for other people and for myself, I'm actually open to trying an online medium. And what's interesting here is as I look at shopper data that I have seen in the US, and my instinct is as Amazon and Walmart and other retailers here in Latin America start to move their needle on e-commerce, things like the Christmas holidays are the driving force in getting people to invest in things like Amazon Prime. And you see a bump every year over year where people buy into Prime and then never leave. And so that's something that as you think through how you engage, getting your shoppers during one of these holidays and then keeping them invested with you all year long becomes a driver of loyalty opportunity for you moving forward. Now here we've got just a couple examples of how we're seeing this manifest in retailers today in your markets. Here you've got Cruz Verde in Colombia and Drogacel in Brazil really kind of showing just a standard website interaction. Now, it's engaging, it's appealing, it's also very product-driven versus basket-driven. And that's the biggest challenge for retailers as a whole today in e-commerce, particularly in consumable spaces. With apparel, with consumer electronics, with a lot of larger purchases, you buy things item by item. Websites are structured to really enable that. But when you move into groceries and consumables, people buy a bunch of items at once. Retailers as a whole, and this is consistent across the board, have struggled to figure out how to move from an item-driven basket online to a basket with multiple items. It's an opportunity moving forward, and the retailer anywhere who finally figures out how to solve it are going to see some very big returns. Here we also see that movement from website to mobile. But you can see, based on the example that we just showed, that as you interact with your shoppers on mobile, the experience, the visibility are very different. Mobile is about simplicity first. And doing that while effectively promoting what you want to promote is very difficult to do, but very important to master. And now we kind of move into this idea of how do we connect to pricing, particularly as a cross-country retailer. Does everything have to be the same? Does pricing have to be the same? Does the communication have to be the same? And the truth is absolutely not. These retailers are looking within their markets. As you think of something like pricing, they're not comparing pricing in Chile to pricing in Argentina, particularly not online when you're focused on convenience. So ensuring that you've got the content right, but also ensuring that the pricing that you have is consistent with what they would see in store in their marketplace is very important. And what that means is those same country-by-country strategies that you employ today, you just need to translate into mobile technologies online. Now, Walmart is making a very interesting play in e-commerce. And the truth is, as you look at across the world, some of Walmart's biggest competitors today are pure play retailers like Amazon and Alibaba. And so they have to be one of those retailers who's moving faster and further along in making e-commerce profitable and effective for them while meeting their shoppers' needs. And they really have kind of invested significantly in technologies across the board. But what's interesting with Walmart is they're not just investing in the technology and infrastructure to sell online. They're investing in and piloting things that allow them to explore fulfillment models as well. And again, this is that conversation that moves from, is e-commerce simply home delivery? Or can e-commerce be something different, where depending on the shoppers, their willingness to spend for the service, and their location, it can manifest in different ways. Walmart right now is probably one of the leading retailers globally in testing and exploring, which is actually quite brave of a publicly traded company. Because regardless of whether the mistakes are made, and they do make mistakes, whenever they make a mistake, it's very easy to see and evaluate with the stock market in the US. But yet they recognize this as a long-term play and are willing to deal with the ramifications of potentially having a few unprofitable movements, understanding that long-term this leads to better profitability in the long run. And here you can see, as I mentioned, this idea of website evolution and moving beyond simply item selling into experiential selling. This is a beautiful example of a retailer using the website almost as an advertising platform and really taking it beyond what you normally see in a website. And I think that's the biggest thing is, as you look at these websites, they do have to become something that almost evolves the digital shelf and also maybe extends beyond what you would see in store. And here, Superama does a very good job of doing that. And then in the same way, that idea of how do you evolve that mobile technology. Shoppers are becoming accustomed to more sophisticated and visually appealing connection points through technology. And retailers and manufacturers have to keep up with that. So, to kind of bring it all together, as you look at kind of how this all works, internet penetration and access is driving that movement into e-commerce and digital communication. As more and more shoppers have access to internet, they are going to be looking to the internet to help them shop. Now, as you move beyond that, this idea of multi-channel or omni-channel communication, it's interesting. As you talk to retailers, and I actually spent some time with a number of retailers who lead their digital platforms in the US, one of them said that they hated the word omni-channel. The truth is, for the average shopper, they don't think about what channel they're shopping in. They don't think about being in a department store versus a convenience store. For them, it's simply about the mission of the trip. I'm getting what I need. And so this idea of whether it's going to multi-channel or also almost looking at your retail as a channelless environment where you simply are getting the shoppers what they need, where they need it, how they need it. Ultimately, the shopper is already there, and we as an industry have to get there. Home delivery from stores is still kind of the key model moving forward in urban markets. But as I said, this idea of as we move to suburban markets, and eventually as you move into rural markets, there may be other ways to tackle the e-commerce conversation that very frankly are less expensive to navigate and execute. Home delivery is very expensive, and it's very hard to make that business on its own profitable. Finding a way to diversify your portfolio and fulfillment creates an opportunity to start to really invest and see profitability in that space. The holidays are going to be the driver. You got to get the holidays right. Obviously, we're moving into them right now. As you look at Christmas and you look at that season as a whole, as you plan for 2018, if your holiday season in digital isn't planned appropriately, you could be leaving money on the table. And then finally, just looking at kind of best-in-class retailers, one of the things that I will tell you in e-commerce that we saw in Europe in the grocery space, the first 2 retailers who introduced online grocery sales about 15 years ago in Europe are now 4th, 5th, I think, in the market, if you look at a country like France. It's because what happened is retailers that weren't in the space took a little time to learn from the mistakes of the newcomers and then leapfrog them. And that's an interesting thing as you look at Latin America and this evolving, is really e-commerce as a whole, anyone can succeed. And it's actually a lot easier to succeed in e-commerce given that you don't have all of the components of bricks and mortar presence to hold you down. So as you look at the market, some of these competitors who are going to come in and elevate the conversation may be competitors that you're not even thinking about today. Okay, now as we kind of go into this, we also look at that global trend. Alibaba is someone you cannot help but think about. What's interesting with Alibaba is for them, they are less focused on the retail to consumer conversation, and they are actually just as focused on B2B conversations. And you can see that in kind of how they go to market, not only in Latin America, but elsewhere. Amazon Mexico, again, one of those global players that are coming into play with pure play. You know, as you look at what they're doing, they have made some great movement in Mexico, but they're struggling not only with fulfillment, but in the payment process. In part, as you look at Mexico and you look at the structure of how financing works, it operates a little bit differently than it does in other countries, which makes it harder to move into a fully integrated e-commerce platform. And you can kind of see that they get around it and trying to find ways to do it, but that will be an ongoing, for any retailer competing in Mexico, an ongoing challenge to understand how to connect the dots. Okay? And now we'll kind of end it by looking at a few things. I've talked about the larger scale demographic implications of what's happening, and I've talked about e-com. Now as we look forward, it's really about what else is coming. You know, one of the things is as technology becomes more and more sophisticated, there are elements that connect to retail that we don't even think about connecting to retail. And so one of the things that you have to think about with an aging population is really how does technology in the home or in the medical field, how can that connect back to retail in other ways? And this is an example here as you see this idea of the smart home really informing various key constituents of what's happening with the shopper and what they need to make their life easier. What's interesting is as we talk about e-commerce, we tend to think of it in the lens of younger shoppers want this ability. But the truth is, as aging consumers move into a place where they may not feel up to going to the store and doing their shopping, e-commerce will become just as important as a service that fulfills the needs that they have as they get older and simplifies their lives. When you look in-store, the idea of bringing technology, moving even beyond things like simple kind of visuals and television screens and things like that, the idea of bringing technology into store to make your shopping experience better and more interesting is becoming something that is very common and will continue to become more common. And also, and he's got his picture here where you can see it all, and you can't hear it. I did not realize this is a video. I apologize. But as you look at that, it's the idea of essentially using technology to serve the needs of shoppers in different ways. As we look at this, we also have this idea of how do you help your store employees do a better job serving the needs of your shoppers. And Teatro is something that really helps them to connect across both the internet offers, the web-based offers, and what shoppers have in store. It's easy to train shoppers on, but it's also easy for shoppers as they use it to answer client need or customer needs very quickly. Look, I've talked a bit about everything. I've gone all over the place with what we've said, but essentially what it comes down to, some of which I've talked about, some of which is new. But right now, regardless of where you are, retailers are having to move into a new world in which they're offering different things and they're executing in different ways. Some of this is facing the shopper, some of it is behind the scenes. But what it really comes down to is building a strategy that really meets shoppers' need as they change and evolve. It's about connecting the dots between mobile and bricks and mortar in a way that allows shoppers experience, but also allows your store employees to meet shoppers' needs in a connected and efficient way. The idea of loyalty and how do you drive loyalty in a larger way with your shoppers becomes increasingly more important. And then it's interesting. This is really kind of dependent on country, but health and wellness is a global phenomenon. Younger shoppers want to maintain their health and get healthier. Older shoppers want to maintain their health and get healthier. Retailers have a role in health and wellness. And it's a matter of understanding country by country what that means and how you can play. And it will be different every place, but what you're going to see as a global phenomenon is retailers trying to figure out how to connect the dots in health and wellness in a way that not only serves their shoppers, but also changes the dynamic of what the role of that store in particular is. It's a lot easier to build a health and wellness relationship with your shopper in-store versus online. And that's one of the ways retailers are actually differentiating between the two. Whether it's having clinics in store or even evolving into things like having gyms. There's a small retailer in the middle of the Midwest in the US, and they literally just came out about a month ago and announced that in every single grocery store that they have, and they're in suburban markets, they are putting in a very popular fast food restaurant that makes hamburgers, and they are putting in one of the hottest fitness companies called Orange Theory into their grocery stores. It changes the dynamic. And you can work out for 60 minutes, burn 1,000 calories, and then have the 1,000-calorie hamburger, which is also a good thing. As you continue on, that connection between produce, fresh and local, cooking more, prepared foods, meal kits, as shoppers, particularly in that suburban movement, find that they have less time to be at home and cook. Helping to build solutions out, both in-store and in other ways, becomes important. Particularly if you look at suburbanites, you look at dual family income households too. And so it's not just having one parent gone for 2 hours a day commuting, it's having two. And then this idea in the back end of supply chain. How does technology and innovation influence the supply chain for retailers and build efficiencies for retailers? But also on the manufacturing side, how well are you keeping up with the sophisticated advancements in supply chain logistics that your retailers are having to employ to meet a changing shopper need? Everyone has to work on this together. And then kind of in bringing it all together, coordinating all of these changes in a way that also meets kind of those changing governmental impacts of what's happening country to country. What we ultimately know is, as I've talked through this very long list of ingredients that retailers need, is retailers are having to do something different but still be profitable. And essentially it comes down to improving the experience both online and in-store that their customers are seeing, using things like automation to really make them more operationally efficient, and then reconnecting with shoppers in a digital way. And they do that very simply. And as you look at this, as a retailer, sadly, this goes to, you have all of this to do to really connect the dots and move forward with your customer. But from a manufacturer perspective, you have to figure out where you can support your retailers to really meet their needs. So look, we know times are changing. I've talked about it. You've got a changing middle class that creates tremendous opportunity in retail, but also requires a new degree of complexity and sophistication. We've got a region that's shifting away kind of from norms into a new way of working and operating. And then e-commerce is really changing the game. It's not going away, but e-commerce and bricks and mortar retail will always need each other to continue to grow. It is complementary, not conflicting, though it may feel like it's stealing share in the near term. And tech is going to continue to change everything about what we do. So with that said, I'm going to end with one last thing. The picture you see there is a 1950s drugstore in the US. And in the 1950s, the drugstore was changing the way retail operated in the US because it brought in things like cash advancement with Western Union. It brought in things like food service in a store. Drugstore, every generation has their changing dynamic. E-commerce is ours. But it's not something we haven't lived through before. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you.